Please listen carefully.
Hi, I'm David Bellamy. Welcome to Listen Up, our podcast all about the contemporary workplace and in particular the importance of listening to employees. Today, I'm joined by our newest team member, brand and content manager, Lydia Blundell. Welcome, Lydia.
Yeah. Hi, so I'm just a couple of months into my new role and I'm going to be taking the opportunity to fully understand Harkin, ask David lots of questions and share some of those insights with our listeners at the same time. So over the next few months, we're going to be doing deep dives into some of the core capabilities of Harkin and exploring some of the major themes that are shaping the modern workplace. But for today's episode, we're going to go right back to where it all began and talk about Harkin's origin story.
Brilliant. Looking forward to that. And don't forget, if this is a subject that interests you or indeed you like what we talk about today, then subscribe to our YouTube channel for more.
Okay, so back to the very, very beginning. You originally launched as Happiness Lab, is that right? So where did that sort of idea for Happiness Lab originally come from?
Yeah, we started life largely in line with my own career, with management consulting. But if I go back 10 years, we were working, doing things best described. I think if anybody remembers the Jim Collins Good to Great book, everybody was reading that. You're too young for that, Lydia, but everybody was reading that back in the day. And so it's how do you take organizations from good to great was the essence. And the work we were doing was akin to that. We weren't using Jim Collins' framework, but typically taking executives away for retreats and working on what were they trying to be, what was the organization they were trying to become, and then subsequent sessions on related topics. But there was a particular thing that we ran, particular exercise around culture that I think is probably the origin of what we are today. And that exercise was around culture, and we'd ask these teams to, in pictures and words, describe your culture if it could be everything you wanted it to be. And you'd get teams go away and pull together images of workplaces that I can only describe as, would win every award going. Right. So it's amazing workplaces. But there were themes, things that people would talk about: proactivity, engagement, highly committed workforces, all those things that people wanted. How could we be faster and all those sorts of things. So you'd have that picture. We then asked them to tell us what it was like today. So same exercise, pictures and words. What's it like here now? And you would get a much less rosy picture. I mean, let's be clear. You'd still get very positive, a very positive reflection of what these organizations were like, and but nowhere near as shiny and sparkly as the one they portrayed as their ambition. And then we would do our big reveal, which is that we have already done this work with your people. And this is what they say it's like to work here. And the best way to describe what would happen afterwards is this: it was like a hand grenade moment, because it would always start a very energized conversation. And largely because, of course, most people would be questioning, how could we be so wrong? And we're not talking, by the way, to be clear, we're not talking about people describing horrible workplaces, but there was just a massive gap in awareness of what people on the ground were experiencing compared to what leadership imagined their organization was like. And I think that really was the moment that was the thing, the repeated experience that just left me thinking, okay, what's happening here? Why is that always the case? So that's, I guess, the kernel of an idea. When we dug a bit deeper, what you realize is that leadership's ability to make sense of their context, their environment, not the context, sorry, that make sense of their culture, what was it like there for people, was largely derived from periodic surveys, so the annual survey. So when we began, I think most organizations were still using an annual type survey. I think most people still do, but that was the only real option. And that was interesting, because I think what we were seeing and hearing from these leaders was actually they're great for certain things, but actually they don't. By the time we've got the results back, it's out of date. Therefore, we don't trust it. And
Yeah.
that sort of process, I think, was leaving them with gaps in understanding. It was inevitable they would end up with gaps. I think the other thing was, they relied on walking around, right? So we can get a great deal of sense of what's going on from being around people. But I think the big challenge in that particular approach, if you watch that episode that we did with Jeff Marlowe, when he talks about sense making and he defines culture, and I quite like this. It's that sort of sense of how we do things, to a collection of mindsets associated with how we do things around here. But the thing for leaders to remember is the we and around here are constantly changing. So when leadership is in the room, everything works differently, right? So that things tend to happen a bit faster. People tend to put on their best face. And so we end up with a distorted view of what's going on in the company. So that was the sort of kernel of the idea. So we set out to say, look, could we create a tool that would bridge that awareness gap, help people to understand more of day-to-day life inside organizations, more of the day-to-day reality for the people on the ground. So that's what Happiness Lab, as we were back then, as we set out to do, that's what we were trying to achieve.
When you launched this new tool, Happiness Lab, what was the sort of initial reaction? It must have been a kind of brand new concept for people, quite revolutionary concept. What kind of were you learning in that initial phase of launch?
Yeah, well, I think rather naively, I thought here is a completely different way of looking at organizational culture and workplace. Who wouldn't want to buy this, right? So I'm thinking, well, this is going to be absolutely omnipresent, if you like, or ubiquitous. But we, the beginning bit, I think there was a huge amount of resistance to the idea of happiness, and that's something I think we'll talk about in a bit further down the line. So there's quite an interesting thing. So Happiness at Work, Happiness Lab. We were, as part of that process of understanding day-to-day life, we were really, I guess, presenting a lens on happiness. And I don't think that was ever the intention. It was, so the idea that maybe people could be happier at work. And if we understood that, then we can help them be happier at work. But so that piece around happiness was probably slightly misplaced. The technology itself that we launched was different, though. And so where we were working with organizations, there were some interesting things that we developed. So the process that we launched, and this is probably the only thing that remains in the platform that we launched with, is that daily check-in routine. So how do you feel and why do you feel that way? So a linear rating scale. So how do you feel? 0 to 100 rating scale, and a free-form narrative that sits alongside it. I think the first thing that we learned was actually there's quite a lot to do to get people to speak. Organizations are forever now talking about speak up cultures and how do we create environments where people's voices are heard and valued. I don't think it's as straightforward as just saying I'm interested in listening to you. There's a lot of baked in resistance and nervousness and lack of trust in organizations. So that was the first thing. And it really boiled down to us in those early years or really boiled down to establishing trust in Harkin first and then in the way organizations would respond to employee voice. For us, for me, still today, I mean, you know this, and now you're here, that being absolutely committed to protecting employee identity, anonymity, is crucial. Where we want psychologically safe environments, we want to hear diverse voices and opinions. But I think I maintain the view that I think the only way you can do that is by giving people channels to engage with the organization around the things that they want to talk about, knowing that their opinions will be devoid of any identifiers, if that makes sense. So we're able to really start to build up that trust. I mean, there were some interesting things that from a development perspective and from a product design, I look back on and shudder, so we launched this platform, where I've described the check-in routine. So you rate how you're feeling. Why do I feel that way? And I share a comment. But the sort of bit behind that, the place that we call the wall today, and again, today is fully interactive, and it's a place for anonymized dialogue. When we first launched, it was static, right? And when I say static, I mean you could just share, just like a posting board where you could say, this is what I'm going through today. This is what's going on in my life. This is how I feel. This is what I had for breakfast. In some cases, it took a while for people to learn what they should talk about in a slightly different context. But then I remember one of our clients saying, could we get a like button or something? It's, you're sort of just looking at comments statically. And so we introduced a like button, and then somebody else sent us a message one day just saying, look, any chance we could have some other reactions? I don't like liking things when people are having difficult times or they're sharing challenging feedback. Okay, so we gradually introduced more interactions. It took years. There was a great deal of nervousness around this, but it took years before we felt comfortable in the way today everybody would feel quite comfortable with sort of fully interactive spaces. This is pre-Teams and pre-Zoom and all that sort of stuff. This was a different way of doing stuff. And so that then fully interactive where people could reply anonymously and engage in dialogue and all that sort of stuff. So that took a long time. But I think about those early days, and organizations were deriving value from understanding and hearing from their people and starting to make change as a result. But that took a bit of time.
So were there any kind of, in those early years, where your intention with Happiness Lab was one thing, but then you realized it had capabilities through, because it's once you put something out into the wild and people are using it, that you fully start to understand what it's capable of. The clients and the use cases shape the technology as it's going forward. So how was that sort of happening in those earlier years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first couple of years were largely just what you described. So we were just, like whether it was the reactions and more interaction and other things. How we might use the platform. I think in many respects, when you listen to your users, your development plans become very easy because you're just getting feedback all the time. But there are some moments, and one in particular that I often talk about as a seminal moment that shapes what we are today almost more than anything else. And that was, there was a moment working with an organization in 2019, and I let's tell the story in the same way because it was very etched. It's not very etched. It's etched in my memory. But I came in on a Monday morning, and one of the first emails I got was Chief People Officer in one of our clients to say, look, we were looking at the wall over the weekend, and so bear in mind at this time still the reactions, but there are no replies at this point, so it's still relatively static. But there's a comment on the wall, accompanied by a rating, so that's how they appear, right? So you've got a number and a narrative, no profile of any sort. But there's a rating of 5, right? So we use this 0 to 100 scale, as I said. It starts at 50. You have to choose to go to 5. And the comment that sat alongside it was, I'm really worried about the future. I don't know how I can afford to pay for the funeral, let alone get my family to it. I guess my mum could have picked a better month to die. And that's sort of quite a bleak thing to look at. And the CEO of this organization had seen this comment and reached out via the Chief People Officer and said, look, can we do something with this? Is there anything we can derive about this person? Now, we had built a platform that was doing sort of team-based mood evaluation. So what's the sentiment of the team? Hadn't really given any, not given any thought. We hadn't done any work at that point around an individualized lens, what's happening for the individuals within the team, just taking things in aggregate. So we had no real mechanism, no mechanism in the system at that point to go back and say, okay, who is this person and what they're doing? So we had to reconstruct it out of the data. And what we saw was fascinating, because you build a profile of an individual user based out of the data and say, okay, well, who is this person and what are they sharing? And we could see that 5 or 6 weeks prior, it was a lady in the US, as it turned out, and she was, I say this, carefully, but sort of utterly unremarkable in data terms, in our terms, right? So she checked in most days. She typically rated between 60 and 70, so mostly positive. And she talked about stuff that people talk about. So sometimes it would be a reference to work, sometimes it would be about home, but just the things that people go through in their lives, right? What are they bringing to work? And then one day she makes this reference to declining health of mother, and she drops in, her rating drops into the 50s at that point. And she hovers around there for a week or so. And then the company introduces a change to the way it allocated shifts. So it's a new technology, a new accompanying sort of process. And that had a broad effect on lots of people in this organization. So suddenly lots of people concerned about change in the way that people get concerned about change, but had some particular impacts. But in this lady, it had a compound effect in as much as, we could see then over the following weeks excuse me, vacillating comments between declining mother's health and financial insecurity and uncertainty presented by this shift allocation system. Mm-hmm. And so and then what we were looking at was a straight line decline, so 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, teens, single figures that result in this comment. And I think I had a massive penny drop moment. Because as I mentioned before, even though we weren't really thinking about happiness, I think there was probably in the back of our minds this idea that if people could only be happier at work. So you're then thinking about individual ratings as though it's a sort of sales figure that you can make it go up all the time. When is in reality, what I think really landed with me at this point was that we're all doing this, right? We're all on this continuum. We're up and down all the time. And arguably what we're trying to do is stop individuals going into decline, or at least, I think today, as we would describe that, rather than how happy people are, any of those sorts of things, we'd be talking about, what's the balance between good and bad days that people have, that sort of thing. Anyway, so that was a really big moment that we changed the way we think about what we're trying to do and how we utilize the data. The second part of it that we realized contained within our data set were all the clues we needed to be able to identify and intercept people who were showing the signs of personal crisis, distress, decline, the sorts of stuff that leads to, prolonged stress, anxiety, burnout, all those sorts of things that we know are prevalent in the workplace. So that pattern of data started us on a path to build the algorithms that we now have in play that would have picked that up. So, I think back on that moment and say, well, had that happened in 2023, we would have picked it up very, very quickly. So Harkin would have seen that here is somebody that something is going on for, and popped up a flag, generated one of those cases that, we talk about. So sort of an alert system that says, here is a person in your organization, an anonymized package of data, and that secure one-to-one link that enables us, or enables people in our clients' organizations to reach out and connect to somebody and say, look, I don't know who you are. I can't know who you are. Harkin has just identified that you might need some help, or you might be struggling, or you're having a tough time, whatever it is that people tend to say. And, are you okay? Would you like to talk? You can talk to me on here. You'll stay anonymous, that sort of stuff. But that all came from, almost one moment where we saw in the data that there was some different stuff in here. I think that started the whole chain reaction of stuff that we did. Now those algorithms are when we didn't launch until 2021, but that started that work started in 2019.
Yeah, that woman's story is a really good example of how perfect storm of factors can so quickly derail somebody's well-being. And the sort of learnings that you took from it show why speed of insight into those kind of personal declines makes all the difference. So 2019, big turning point when you realise how Harkin can help individuals as well as... If that was a big turning point, then March 2020, the following year, must have been a pretty big moment for Harkin or Happiness Lab, as I think it still was.
Yeah. I think March 2020 was significant, wasn't it? And for lots and lots of reasons. And we seen the end of the impact of the pandemic? I don't think so. It's changed lots and lots of things, but it certainly changed things quite quickly for us. I mean, there are things that I reflect on, like, immediately you saw the pressures organizations felt when their workplace just distributed. So suddenly managers' abilities to stay in touch with their team, to feel connected to them, to be able to get a sense of what was going on and how they were doing, well, they were largely wiped out, weren't they? So people were at home, and we could no longer really know what was happening and how people were doing. So at that level, again, so that sort of individualized well-being thing became interesting, became challenging for organizations, but even just the group sentiment, the need for connection, the need for engagement, all started to get challenged. And so that was a really interesting time, but it did lots of other things as well. I think one of the things if there were positive things that came out of that period, one of them has to be the sort of the uptick or the increase in empathy that we saw emerging, because we were looking into people's bedrooms at times, and so suddenly, the things that we take for granted, people showing up to work and being in a certain place at a certain time and doing stuff. And then when you were looking into people's homes and you realize what their context is and where they're working and their, the things which particularly, there were some unique factors, weren't there? So sitting at home and trying to homeschool your kids in the background whilst doing your work, those sorts of things were putting immense pressure on people. But I think there were aspects where we were watching organizations just look, take care of yourselves, do the right thing, make the calls you need to make. That was a really interesting thing. And we've seen many of those things continue from a Harkin perspective. I remember sort of conversations that sort of play into that. Do we understand what's going on for people and how to, and that provision of care and, well, as I say, connection and belonging. I remember talking to one of our clients months in, when we were allowed to go out and we had a coffee, and he was describing how, so good job, well paid, lots of space at home, a dedicated office, all that sort of stuff, and saying that, but so I've got all the support mechanisms, I've got the space, the right environment, the right kit, and yet I'm finding it really difficult. So what's it like for everybody else? And I think that sort of still sits with me in a way that it was a sort of realization that, for me, again, that individualized sense of what's going on for people, we never really get a good sense of, but we were able to help the companies we were working with to just maintain a sense of, are people okay and what are they going through, and that sort of stuff. So really really useful. I think the other thing that's happened around then, and certainly from our perspective, so we talked about the algorithms before, but the trend that I don't think we've seen stop yet. So the number of people requiring support for well-being, mental health, anxiety, stress, those sorts of things, just went through the roof. So as we in our platform, we are talking about good days and bad days, and how we can sort of understand the makeup of people's experiences in the workplace. There were periods where the number of people experiencing prolonged spells of continuous bad days, that sort of stuff was going through the roof. And I think again so we sort of had to pedal a lot faster in our development at that time to make sure our platform could support people in the right way, but also just sort of trying to keep pace with the what were emerging needs for organizations.
Yeah, I think you're right that we're definitely still feeling the impact of the pandemic and the aftershocks. And looking back in hindsight, I think the craziest thing is that we often talk about organizations being quite slow to take on major change, and literally overnight in March 2020, so many organizations proved their ability for agility, adaptiveness, but also fostering a culture of care in their organizations. But that wasn't sort of the end of the major changes, I suppose, for the workplace. So since then, we've got artificial intelligence on an exponential rise. The average employee is experiencing more large-scale tech implementations than ever before. So really the years sort of since the pandemic have been years of endless change. So how do all these kind of swirling factors start to prompt in your mind the shift from Happiness Lab into Harkin?
Yeah, well, I think the AI thing is obviously a much more recent piece, but in those years, immediately, it was 2021 that we finally dropped Happiness Lab. In fact, I think it was December 2021 we rebranded. That was a combination of factors, and a very sort of looking inward for a moment, where we were. I don't think I'd realised how many workarounds and how much time we were investing in, even down to things like onboarding packs and launching stuff. We were talking about happiness at work, and I've got nothing against the happiness at work movement and all that sort of stuff. I think there's lots of things in there I support, but it was a distraction for us, right? So we were trying to sort of find a way to I guess make our brand sit more closely with what we actually were, rather than something that we were filling the gaps between. Why are you called happiness when what you're doing is something different? And Harkin sort of fell out of a conversation with a mentor, who was just challenging me around a few things and I remember reacting quite emotionally about protection of this brand that I'd created, and thinking that that this is the brand that we would stay, but is it getting in the way? Is it a distraction? All the stuff I've just said, and so we finished the conversation, and I think that was the point I looked back and thought of all of the different ways that we were adjusting our language and what we were doing and all that sort of stuff for the presence of this word Happiness Lab. And actually, we'd always expected resistance to the idea of happiness in a brand from some parts of leadership. Honestly, I didn't think I'd expected managers to feel resistant to it. And then what we discovered, and it only came out after we transitioned to Harkin, but people would say, well, actually, they felt judged by the idea of even though we weren't measuring happiness, because we were called Happiness Lab, it felt like what we were doing was reporting on how happy people were. And consequently, managers were feeling judged by the idea that I can't control all of this stuff and it feels like it's on me. And that was a really interesting thing to hear afterwards. But also, I think employees, frankly, would be looking at Happiness Lab and the way that we were doing stuff and saying, okay, I don't understand. This is not something I feel about or think about at work in the same way. Now, interestingly, Harkin derived from an old English word, hearken. We all know hark the herald angels sing, right? So to listen attentively or to prick up one's ears are sort of definitions that we use. But to listen attentively fits much more closely with us. And once we did that, I think it changed the relationship that everybody had with this platform. It suddenly became much less about what we might perceive as softer or ancillary aspects to work, and much more about, are we able to hear, or are we listening to people, and clarity for us in the way that we think about. Actually, for us, it's about activating voices, helping employees to speak more freely at work, to share their ideas, their opinions, their views on stuff, give feedback, to check in on well-being of themselves and others, but also for the company then to be able to hear more of what really matters on the ground. And it just fills that gap, doesn't it? So that, it's funny that, what's in the name kind of thing, well, quite a lot, I think. When I realized that you make that move, it clarified so many things for us. So the rebrand was quite important, particularly on a journey where you then say, well, look at the way the work has changed in the last couple of years. There are things that I'm still learning a lot about, like inclusion is a great example of this. We'd always talked about equal voice. We'd always talked about, I guess the ability with anonymized conversations and the impact that can have on people speaking up and all those sorts of things. But and whether that is about minority voices, lots of women will tell, this is something I'm learning about, but lots of women will talk about their experiences through their careers and how, that perhaps their voice doesn't carry as much weight, just as an example, but that's pronounced through lots of different groups. And then as we start to understand neurodiversity a little bit more and what's happening, you realize the importance of having tools that give people the opportunity to contribute to shaping the workplace, where, if I go into a room with people, particularly with senior people, so we go back to psychological safety. If I go in a room with senior people, only some voices get heard. They're typically dominant ones or the confident ones. If I happen to be somebody that is more reflective in nature, or I need to gather my thoughts, or I want to contribute in a different way, I don't have the confidence to speak up, I hesitate before I say something and somebody else then says the thing I was going to say. There's all those sorts of things that play out and work, so I don't get to contribute as much. And so, watching that stuff play out is really interesting, because the way that we developed, particularly in later years, well, as I keep talking about the end, and the anonymous dialogue components, the ability to engage with people with the safety of protected identity, suddenly means we get the things that we talked about, like diverse opinion, diverse voices, dialogue between grades and teams and functions, where we can make much more sense then. And that's ultimately the point, isn't it? So this idea of sense making, again, covered in that Listen Up episode with Jeff Marlowe, that ability to understand what's going on for people, not just from leadership down, but actually people on the ground, sort of making sense that, this is how I'm experiencing work, and hearing whether my colleagues actually experience work in the same way. Those sorts of things become really important to shaping a sort of an aligned future, if you like.
Yeah, I think the anonymity thing is really very crucial to Harkin. It's the reason why all the tools available are so effective. And I know that early on, when you were launching this platform, people would say, what people need to stand by their comments and feedback. If you can't put a name to it, then you shouldn't say it, essentially. And I definitely think the world has moved on a lot in that respect, and people have a greater understanding of quite how many barriers are in place against people speaking up. And it doesn't have to be a negative thing. It could just be contributing their ideas, and that's just a good thing for everybody.
Yeah. Listen, I think the reasons that's a really good point. The reason that people don't speak up, manifold, and I think we'll probably cover this separately in a future episode, won't we? Because of sort of the importance of psychological safety and how that contributes to what people will and won't share at work. It is really important. But there are things right out there that so I think people have always expected. If you give people anonymous channels to share their views and opinions, and they're just going to say horrible stuff. And as I go right back, so I go back in the journey a bit to the point where we were still relatively static on the wall. And we worked with a public sector organization, and they used to use surveys, and they had a team of people whose job it was to basically go through and moderate, redact any libelous or slanderous, I can't remember which one it would be, but comments and profanities. Basically, people were given an opportunity to share their opinions about work once in a while, and they would say horrible things, right? And so they had a team of people whose job it was to sort of basically go out and erase and hide all the stuff that needed to be hidden. So that organization, as part of our evolution, said, we cannot use this product unless we have some moderation tools, right? We are going to need to police what people share and therefore sort of take things away from public view. So we built a moderation suite, which was the first part of what is now much more robust, but wasn't used, right? Nobody used it because people, this doesn't operate like Twitter. These are not strangers interacting. I know that the surveys are different, but when people get to share their views and they're trusted to have an opinion about work, to share their experience, knowing that the organization cares about them, that their voice matters, that they matter, very, very few people will abuse that. The reality is, I might say something a little controversial, but it's largely derived out of this is my experience, or I think we could be doing this differently. And what happens instead is that rather than that being a snowball of a kind of let's everybody jump on the bandwagon and have that, and have a sort of a rant at leadership, it typically doesn't happen. That sort of people will engage in dialogue about whether that's their experience. And so that's that part of that sense-making thing I was describing before. You'll see somebody saying, well, actually, that's not my experience. And did you know that we have this? And have you read that? And, have you checked the intranet for information about this subject? And so it just helps people to sort of navigate their way through, large, complex environments. I think the other part about I guess the sort of people speaking up thing that has really interested me, I think, again, this is a post-pandemic thing, that the people being prepared to share personal challenges. So I am overwhelmed. I am struggling. I'm really finding it very difficult to function right now. So alongside the sort of the data picking up signs of people that might be in distress, there's the other feature, which is sort of, I guess, the other aspect of not technology feature, but the other feature of human nature, which is I'm prepared to share some narrative about what's going on for me. A bit like that lady that we mentioned before, in the story about, the declining well-being through sort of poorly mother. That today would likely receive a dramatically different response from people. So when I talked about the fact that we would pick it up much sooner, but actually you share that story on Harkin today where it's fully interactive, people use it very differently. I would guarantee that they would have lots and lots of feedback and support and kindness and offers of help and all that sort of stuff. People generally care for one another, and that when you're all on the same team, you're all trying to go to the same place, you're all trying to make stuff happen. That caring and kindness comes out in spades, and I think that was that's been a really interesting thing to observe. And there is a brilliant for anybody interested, by the way, there's a brilliant case study animation, which is a much abridged version of something that really happened in one of our clients, where somebody's done just gone on and shared a story of how they were in sort of personal crisis, long-term struggles with their own mental health, and then got some feedback at work that had sort of tipped them into a bit of a spiral. And then over the course of 24, 48 hours, you see 25, 26 people, I think, in this organization all replying with encouragement, support, kindness, go speak, check in with the EAP, talk to somebody in HR, click on the link here and you can have an anonymous conversation with somebody that results in the original user coming back and saying, look, thank you. You've all encouraged me to go and get some help, and I booked my first counselling session. And those sorts of individualized bits, of course, Harkin is still designed and developed for the organization in the sense that can we understand more about what's going on for our people. But a major component of that, of course, is keeping people fit and healthy at work, and that means supported and cared for, right? So.
Yeah, I definitely think one of the biggest sort of differentiators from like the traditional sort of survey-based models, something that's definitely struck me looking at the way Harkin works is, and something probably a lot of leaders would underestimate about it until they saw it functioning as the peer-to-peer support. So it's not just leaders identifying, pockets of problems that they need to solve. It's the community that it mobilizes is one, very heartwarming in certain cases, like you just explained, but two, very efficient way of solving problems, becoming more dynamic and like a, I suppose, flatter organization where everybody can contribute to the progress of goals and problem solving, which is a good thing for everyone. So
Yeah,
that brings us up more or less to the present day, and it must be strange for you to have walked through that little potted history of Harkin from Happiness Lab. And I know from working with you on a daily basis that you're very involved in the kind of actual technology of the platform. So if you were to pull out kind of three game changers on that timeline of, things that really excited you and things that changed the game for Harkin, set us on a new course, what would you
yeah.
what would you say?
Well, I think one which I've talked about already, so I won't talk much about it again, but that the evolution of the sort of well-being alerts, small p predictive, you can't be ever certain, but the fact that we can see things coming just gives organizations and their management an opportunity to step into things much sooner. That really, for me, is much, or to greatly simplify it, about saying that we are all too often picking up the signs of people in distress when they're prepared to tell us. Right. So that's why EAPs and all the wellbeing services, the amount of money that's spent, your organizations are trying very, very hard to provide well-being, to help, well-being services to help their people. The problem is the point of access is almost exclusively when somebody is prepared to put their hand up, and that's all too often way too late. So just accelerating that process and saying we can get people to conversations sooner just gets some control, some influence over outcomes that helps us to support people. And even things like, as you referred to a moment ago, the community of care, well-being support, peer-to-peer, peer-to-peer support, that stuff makes a dramatic difference, even to the one ridiculous example that I might offer, which is the latest or the last emoticon that we had of reactions that you might apply with the hug, which I resisted for ages. And I think, what if you share that you're having a difficult time and two or three of your colleagues pick the hug button and just, and I used to think that was crazy, but almost silly, but actually it isn't, right? What I've realized is that matters to people, right? I suddenly feel validated and heard and supported by my colleagues. I'm reminded that people care about me, and that sort of resets the clock a little bit. So that whole well-being thing, from the algorithms through to the way that the dialogue and all that sort of stuff supports people, I think is one of my top three. Second one, I think, is probably, we haven't talked about this one yet, but in that move to good days and bad days, we implemented a change to the way we reported some data. So we introduced this thing called good day ratio. So it's a calculation of good days to bad days experienced by any population in your workforce, right? And so translating that into a single number. And what we've developed over time is a sense of, this is a sensitive number that tells you basically the health of your organization, the morale, the mood, the motivation of your team in real time. And I don't mean real time as in instantly available at the end of a quarterly survey. I mean live. So when you do stuff in an organization, when things happen, so organizations, large organizations are complex adaptive systems. They are constantly changing. And so context, moving, it's incredibly helpful to understand what's going on for our people. And even if, so if the narrative is providing us the context and the understanding of why things are changing, but the extent to which you're watching your population's motivation and morale move can give you a great insight to basically, the fuel in the tank for your journey. I think that GDR is potentially a game-changing way of looking at organizational health. The and we have countless case studies now where you'll watch organizations going through significant change, whether that is introduction of, as you mentioned earlier on, whether that is the introduction of new technologies or transformation programs. And we know that they're happening with the ever increasing frequency. But as organizations are looking to sort of renew and reinvent themselves, there are personal consequences and personal, what's the wrong word here? So that there are implications for the people in our teams of those changes, right? So how well we think we communicate them, how people receive them, the fears that we introduce. So understanding what's going on in our population in that lens, I think, is incredibly useful. So it helps to guide leadership decision making and helps us to get, I think, to making those interventions much quicker.
Yeah, and in one of the case studies that we've seen recently, it's not just knowing where you are, but informing your next steps in terms of, the visuals that you get can be really quite striking. It's here and then it's here and it's here. So I know in one, it was felt as if you moving on at the right time after change and making sure that your workforce are in that place and ready to move with you is something that GDR indicates really clearly.
Yeah, I think that's right. It becomes but it's a now moment and a now measure, isn't it? So it's where are our people, and that sort of sense of trying to move too quickly. We're all trying to move our organizations forward as quickly as we possibly can, but that has to be done in the context of the people that we're leading, right? So are they on the journey with us? Do they have the energy for it? Those sorts of things are just helpful to understand, and that starts to give us a different lens through which to consider our next steps. I think you're absolutely right. The third thing, which again we sort of largely talked about, but the evolution and the investment that we've made in anonymized dialogue. So whether that's in sense making terms or connection building, but just really sort of building on that original premise that if we can give people a safe place to share their opinions and their ideas and share their experiences, and then building out into more interaction into other things like we introduced team rooms, which I know it's not sort of supposed to be a feature plug, but it's more emphasis of the way that these tools sort of evolve. You watch the sort of the nature of dialogue and the importance of creating spaces where people feel able to contribute asynchronous, anonymized conversation and exploration of topics helps us to ensure we are getting that diverse opinion into the things we're trying to do. So how do you feel about this? And that one came about, by the way, from again back to almost like where we were in the beginning, where people are sharing feedback. Could I have this? Could I have that? And I remember getting a phone call one day from a manager in one of our clients just saying, look, we've had something happen on Harkin today where somebody shared some feedback about some aspect of work, right? And management took us in a room to find out more about that. So we're all sitting in a room looking at each other awkwardly, feeling desperately unsafe to share our opinions. And when we came out of the room, having nobody said anything, a few of us got together and said, well, wouldn't it be good if Harkin could help us do that? Because that's the place that we can go share our stuff. And so anonymized focus groups. And so you then you've got this live dialogue playing out and spin them off into a team room for a prolonged, asynchronous, anonymized, month-long discussion on a topic. So everybody gets to contribute in different ways as an example. And then they've spun out into slightly different things. So people are using them for community interest groups in terms of talking about the issues that certain populations feel at work, or creating spaces where people can go and make sense of complex subjects. One of my favorites that, again, something that I never really thought or understood much about, but a group of people in one of our clients created a group which was about sharing their experiences of menopause or perimenopause in the workplace, right? So rather than share that publicly on the wall, and sort of, even though it's anonymized, having a team room where they could go talk about that. And these are public spaces. They're not private spaces, if that makes sense. It's not those hidden groups like you hear about with WhatsApp. This is a there's a list of the rooms available, and what we saw, there was people going in and sharing powerful stories about their experiences and the challenges they face, and helping one another, but then also other people in the organization joining that room to understand. And I think that's really cool. So then you start to build, again, that sense of belonging and connection and inclusion in the workplace. I think they're really cool. So that sort of, I'll recap those three because I've been talking for a long time, as I tend to. But so the well-being capabilities, the introduction to GDR, and that continuation of anonymized dialogue. I think those are the three things I think are really stellar.
Yeah, team rooms are another really good example of giving people the autonomy to collectively discuss things that matter to them, move forwards. It's just a great example of kind of genuine teamwork and collaboration. Okay, so we've dwelt a lot in the past. It's time to look to the future. What's coming up next for Harkin, do you think? What's on the horizon? What are you excited about?
Well, I think there are, from a technological perspective or a technology perspective. You touched on AI earlier in this conversation, and I think that's starting to play into the workplace in a much more material way. So it's coming on in leaps and bounds, isn't it? And we have been testing, for example, you get lots of narrative on Harkin. We've been testing sentiment type analysis tools for many years and trying to understand how they would work. And honestly, we've found that when it comes to analyzing individual sentiment expressed by employees, that they haven't added anything to date. The way Harkin is able to display data and the way the human brain can process it has been enough. But there are generative AI is reaching a point now where you sort of realize that if I've got 1,000 comments and I'm looking through it, one of the behaviors that we're aware of, driven by unconscious bias largely, is that people will tend to focus on the things that catch their eye. So we have a tendency to go look at the negative comments to see what problems I need to fix, and what that does is gives us perhaps a misread of what's going on in the organization. And so we believe, and we're starting to test this now, that using generative AI will be able to pass, if you like, large strings of language, so that we can get a general sense of sentiment, a general sense of what priorities the organization should have. So if we imagine just over the last month, we've got 1,000 people that have shared their views on different things. What are the top three things that we should be thinking about? What are the things that people are most optimistic about? When people are having great days at work, what are the things that typically drive that? When people are having bad days at work, what are the things that are causing that? Now, we can do that to an extent today, but it's because there's lots of ways that we can analyze and filter data. But I think what AI will do for us is make that process super slick. So much quicker, much more accessible. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And so that's certainly, in Q1 next year, we'll be hoping to pilot to pilot some of this capability with some live clients. See what that throws up. But my sense of what we've done to date is that could be another game changer for the way that we're able to interpret data and employee sentiment. That's going to help immensely. I think the other there's a more human side, right? So technology is only one thing. So it's not, we talk a lot about the product, but of course the product only exists in the context of how people use it. And I come right back, if I go right back to the beginning of the story, and we were talking about what organizations want, we're in a time when more and more organizations are finding it hard to compete, to grow, to manage their costs and keep their people with them. So there's sort of this imbalance in pressures. And the big benefit of real-time or live employee sentiment, live employee voices, it gives us an opportunity not only to foster better relationships between the elements of our business, but from top to bottom, from leadership with the body of the organization. But it also gives us the stuff that we should be doing right now. So the big criticism I think I've always had of the "you said we did" sort of process that typically follows periodic surveys, is that we've all been on the receiving end of this, right? You get that "you said we did" and here are the change programs. The problem is that none of us ever feel heard in that. We can't remember what we said because it was ages ago. We don't really feel invested in the solution that's coming from somewhere else. And consequently, everybody's doing lots of work associated with stuff that isn't delivering a return. And there's a great opportunity, I think, to sort of just pick up, just as you were talking about before, the real-time stuff and say, can we start to, there's a great book called, Move Fast and Fix Things, which is about, how do we go quickly as an organization. And when I read that book, I kept found myself thinking, crikey, if those people were armed with Harkin, where they could see live the big problems that need fixing right now, and then building these sort of culture squads to go off and tackle those things in rapid iterations, that's going to close that feedback loop between employee sentiment feedback and things changing in the organization, which, of course, most people would say they don't really experience. So those are two things, I think, on the list for 2024. And yeah, so that's probably my two things.
Sounds like a heavy post-Christmas workload to me. Okay, so final question, perhaps the most important one. Who is Harkin for? What kind of organization is going to derive the most benefit from this platform today?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how other tech founders would respond to this question. There's a real tendency, isn't there, to imagine every company in the world needing your product. I mean, I think there is a practical bit that with scale comes complexity. So for us, that larger organization, it gets harder to stay in touch with stuff. Information moves slower through an organization, particularly upwards, where there are more people involved. Hierarchies tend to do that, don't they? So there's a scale question, but I think almost more importantly than that, you kind of have to care enough, right? So that if you believe that getting feedback from employees, I mean, let's be clear, right? The people in the body of our organizations interact with our customers. They deal with the systems that we've implemented. They work with our suppliers. They put up with the procedures that we create, but if we believe that population has valuable insight to share with us that will help us to make better, faster decisions, and we care about taking them on a journey with us, because this is that sort of get on the bus analogy. But I think we prefer, rather than getting the right people on the bus, the people are fueling the bus, right? So that's it doesn't go very quickly if your people aren't coming with you. I think the leadership teams and the organizations that genuinely care about that stuff, they're the people that Harkin is designed for. I could make a case for Harkin in every organization. Should all large organizations have a place where people can speak safely and anonymously? It doesn't mean you don't have one-to-ones with people. It doesn't mean you don't use surveys. It doesn't mean you don't use Teams and Slack and Yammer. But there is something powerful and unique about giving people somewhere space to go and contribute their ideas and thoughts, where everybody's voice counts, where everybody's opinion has equal weight. That's valuable. So yeah, I think it's a question of larger organizations where these problems are most pronounced, but those that care enough to want to hear from their people.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I was wondering how long it would take you to include an analogy. I thought we might go through the whole podcast, but then fuel in the bus came in. Okay, so there you have our origin story. I certainly feel like I've learned a lot in that episode, so I hope you have too. We've touched on a lot of things from AI, tech implementations, inclusion, care, psychological safety, effective leadership. We've covered a lot of ground, and we will be revisiting all of those things in future episodes in more detail. So make sure you subscribe to our channel to keep getting Listen Up.
Fantastic. All right. Listen, Lydia, thank you. That was a good interview. It's our first one of this nature. I'm going to try and do more of these. We'll still have some guests joining us in future. But good job. That was interesting. And then let's on to the next one.
Yeah. Until next time. Bye.